Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Kremen, Professor of History and Director of the Lewis University History Center, which manages the Howard and Lois Edelman Regional History Collection. I have the honor of organizing on behalf of the History Department, the College of Humanities, Fine Arts, and Communications, and Lewis University, the Fall History Lecture Series. It is my complete joy to convene the Fall 2021 Fall James and Mary Claire Chapin Lecture Series. Today's program is Unvarnished, Civil Rights in Our Backyard. I'd like to introduce to you Lewis University President, Dr. David Lippman, to greet you.
Thank you, Dr. Kremen. Welcome everybody to Lewis University. I know many of you are our students, our faculty, our employees, but some of you are guests, and we want to welcome you to our campus. I also want to welcome Fran for her family's commitment to history, to this lecture, and to allowing us on a yearly basis to really take a deep look at something that is impacting our local region in terms of the way that history develops. In reading a little background on today's topic, and I really want to thank you're going to be introduced, not by me, but I really want to thank our four speakers today and the work that they're doing. I also want to note that Dr. Christopher Sent is in the audience, our provost, and Dr. Tennille Allen, as well as several other members of our faculty who received a grant on the legacies of American slavery, and really grateful for the work they did in preparing the application and receiving that. And today's topic really is about the legacy of American slavery in our backyard. So I really appreciate the work that's being done here. We talk about ourselves as a sanctified zone, as a place in which we seek to be a community which is a place of justice, a place of dignity, an anti-racist community, and we recognize that that is an ongoing challenge because there are institutional issues that constantly confront us and that we're always uncovering, unvarnishing, so to speak, peeling back the layers. And so we're grateful to this lecture. I'm really grateful to Dr. Kremen, the entire history department, the entire faculty for their commitment to our sanctified zone and to continue to remind us of the ways in which we are on a journey and not fully realized that we are a sanctified zone, but we are on our way there. So thank you, Dr. Kremen. Thank you, all of you, for being here, and thank you to our speakers.
I would like now to invite my colleague, Dr. Eileen McMahon, to come forward. She's a professor of history, and she will bring forth Lewis University's land acknowledgement.
Lewis University humbly assumes a centuries-old custom of Native peoples to remember our common attachment to this land. As an institution of higher learning, it is our duty to remind future generations the debt we owe to the original stewards of this continent. As a Catholic, Lasallian, and liberal arts institution, we nourish our common spirituality when we reflect upon the variety of historic experiences of people who have and will live in this sacred place. We acknowledge the land on which we stand and occupy today as the original home of many past indigenous peoples, most recently the Illini, Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Odawa, Sauk, Fox, and Miami. We acknowledge indigenous understanding of and reverence for the land and its resources, and the respect indigenous people have shown towards all life upon it. We acknowledge a history of racism and displacement of these people from their homelands and disrespect for traditional cultures. We recognize the vast collective wisdom of Native nations, past and present, who continue to reside upon it now. We acknowledge the extreme hardship Native and non-Native Americans have endured on the road to recovering their culture spiritually, physically, and economically. We must now stand shoulder to shoulder to respect and give assistance to promote the inclusion of Native Indigenous peoples in our society. We must show the same reverence towards the land and our environment as Indigenous people have, so that we together can begin to heal our tortured past and create a unified historical narrative of our common humanity.
Thank you so much, Eileen. I'd like to, again, thank everyone for coming today. It's a joy to meet. The Shaponiak Lecture Series started in the fall 5 years ago. And we had the discontinuity of last year where we didn't meet. I think about this with so much appreciation for our chair, Jim Talon, who's been very busy on campus. 2 weeks ago, he hosted the Midwest World History Conference. We have John Happ, author, in the audience. He'll be on campus tomorrow speaking about his book, The Navigation Case, Training, Flying, and Fighting from the 1942 to 1945 New Guinea War. Take a note, that will be in the academic building in 158 at 2 o'clock. So please put that on your calendar. Also, consider going over to the Gaylord Building Historic Site, where we have Life Along the Canal, the art of John M. Lamb, on view through December. So much gratitude. We have marketing and communications, conferencing and events, technology, Dr. Laura Franklin. We have Sarah Paskowitz, who worked so hard to get us all here in one piece. And of course, in the back, John Kilpatrick and John Carey, who are streaming us live at this moment. I would like to shift now, and I will introduce to you Donna Sack. She's the Vice President and Chief Programs Officer at Naper Settlement. She's been a great partner to Lewis University, the History Department, and especially the History Center. I'll just say a few words. The Unvarnished project participant communities bring together 6 communities with a historical society, museum, or cultural organization that is committed to researching and sharing their community's history of housing discrimination. These include Appleton, Wisconsin, Brea, California, Columbus, Ohio, Naperville, Illinois, Oak Park, Illinois, and West Hartford, Connecticut. Today we welcome members of the Midwest contingent. Without any further ado, Donna Sack. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. So the group that's with me here today on the panel, we've been working together now for a number of years around our topic area. And I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Sarah Doherty. And Sarah is Associate Professor at North Park University. She's also a board member at the Historical Society of Oak Park and River Forest. And this is really a project that is about the journeys of history organizations to tell the histories of their communities in what I like to call a really, really whole way. Frank Lipo is Executive Director of the Historical Society of Oak Park and River Forest. And right next to me is Dr. Sabrina Robbins, and she is a board member of African Heritage Inc. in Appleton, Wisconsin. And we're going to share our journeys with you today, both our journeys individually as organizations in this project, and at least a brief bit of history of our communities, but also our journeys together as a learning community, as a cohort. And so I will start with how this project came to be. The project is funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The grant, I can tell you, was put in at about 10:36 p.m. On the last day of November of 2016. a pivotal moment, of course, for us in our journey in the United States, in looking back over the last 5 years or so, was that time period. And we were awarded the grant in almost the following year, 2017, which is when we all began our journey together. And the grant's purpose originally was to move history organizations toward interpreting de facto and de jure segregation in the northern and western United States. And why did we focus on the northern and western United States? It really was because so often the general public, the museum field itself, really looks and can make a pass and go, oh, that's really a Southern story to tell. And it's not a Southern story to tell. It's a national story to tell. And so our effort was to, the Naperville Heritage Society's effort, was to really convene 5 other organizations that were representational of the field itself. So we have a very large historical society, the Ohio History Center. We have Brea, California, which is an organization with 1 staff member in Orange County. And then the organizations that are represented here at the table, Oak Park has a few staff members, an active board, and Dr. Robbins' organization, African Heritage, Inc., is a cultural organization. And so we really had a good blend. West Hartford, Connecticut is also part of this project, as Dr. Kremen mentioned. And the other approach that we really wanted in gathering these groups together is we wanted to tell stories of exclusion that occurred in these communities, and the way that exclusion happened could vary community by community, and who was excluded also varied by community to community. So if you look at the West Hartford group, for example, there's talk of maps, for example, that were laid out, some with Stars of David, some with crosses. And that's how neighborhoods functioned in the mid-20th century. That's how they were laid out. So we really wanted to be able to tell a wide variety of stories. So as we moved along in our learning journey, we all have worked together, as I've mentioned, for the past few years, and we have tried to visit every community, to have an immersion in each community, and to hear from local folks, oral histories, to actually get out to field study, to have on-site visits. And this has been a really, really important part of our process, because when we come together and convene around the table, and now we convene around Zoom, and I will share that the only community that we have been unable to visit has been Columbus, Ohio, and we're really holding out hope that we're going to be able to convene in January in Columbus. Our consortium activities have included this wealth of professional development that I've been describing. There's also organizational capacity building. We all work with organizations that have staffs or volunteers, board members, community members. One of the early things that we did in our project is the International Sites of Conscience came in, and in each location ran a 2-day series of focus groups so that we could actually hear from our community members on how they were perceiving the moment that we were in, but also what were they thinking about inclusive history. When you're talking about a community being a sundown town, there are people that were the victims and were excluded There are people who were part of a system where that happened within communities. Some people are comfortable talking about that. Some people are not comfortable talking about that. So we had to hear. The first thing we had to do is to hear from our communities on how they were thinking about even hearing this history. We also had a significant portion of our commitment which was toward research. We polled nationally museum goers, museum professionals, the general public, and then this year, teachers, about how they felt about inclusive history. In the case of teachers, we also polled them in what kind of support do they need from history organizations in order to tell an inclusive story, an inclusive history story within their curriculums. And we heard loud and clear what the teaching community was feeling in this year. So this is another aspect of our program that's significant. Our two primary outcomes that we are around the corner from, March 2022, we will launch an online exhibit, and we will also launch a corresponding curriculum. And we are working with pedagogy specialists, we are working with K through 12 teachers, we are working with K through 12 administrators to find out what they need so that they can teach within their school systems, within their districts. And also, we want to know what kids are thinking too, and how and where they are and what kind of materials they have access to. And we know that right now, inclusive history is heavily debated across the country. There are many who want to see inclusive history taught in schools, and there are many that don't want to see inclusive history taught in schools. So this is we're in a much more pivotal moment than we thought we would be with this when we launched in 2016. So another aspect of our outcomes is really to share as widely as possible what we're learning, what our journey's been. That includes producing technical leaflets for museums, for example, as well as getting out there case studies and best practices articles about our journey. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Naperville story. So Naper's settlement as a museum was founded in 1969. That date really shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. It was a time that really saw a plethora of history organizations, historic house museums come into being. We're only a half a decade out really from the bicentennial, from the US bicentennial. And we're also in a moment where we're coming out of a lot of change, right? The 60s. And so we see this wealth of history organizations that are founded. And in the case of Naper's settlement, and in the case of many of these organizations that were founded during this time, we were founded to tell a 19th century white pioneer settlement story. That is the founding of the organization. And it was in about 2006 that we looked at ourselves through a community engagement process and said, you know, Naperville doesn't look like this anymore. We have certainly old-time, multi-generational families, but we're also at a point where our community has expansive diversity. If you look at Naperville today, for example, 22% of our population is Asian, 5% African American, 5% Hispanic or Latino, as is defined by the census. 3% will self-identify as being multi-race. So how do we share community history when we're locked into a mission that is solely 19th century? And we moved forward and said, you know what, we really need to be telling the history of the community as it is today. So I want you to take a peek at this chart, and this is fairly indicative of what you will find in a community that was a sundown town. And we're going to talk expansively about that today. But not only a sundown town, but what kind of practices were in play from a housing and real estate perspective that kept communities all white. And that is what our project is really in-depth exploring. And you might see that up until 1970, Naperville had one African American resident and 2 Asian residents. And then you see a significant shift that begins happening in the 70s. So the minority populations in Naperville, we actually know who the African American resident was. A woman named Sybil Dunbar. She's buried in Naperville Cemetery. And we had what was known as the Chinese laundry in town. So we actually can identify who the people were that were in Naperville. But we saw a Facebook posting about 3 years ago, and it was, does anybody remember when Jimmy Yakamoto was in Naperville in the 1940s? And we're all looking around going, wait a minute, this is a surprise. We did not know that there were Japanese families in Naperville. We do a little bit more digging, and we find that through the War Relocation Authority, there were Japanese families that had been interned in internment camps. And through the War Relocation Authority, communities could put a call out when they wanted workers. So if there were fewer agricultural workers, for example, or if a hospital needed workers, or even a college. So we started doing research and found that there were Japanese workers who were in Naperville. So we're beginning to uncover stories that had long not been shared. Not that there weren't people that knew these stories. They were just marginalized stories and not shared globally to the community. And that's the work, that's the journey that we're on right now. And to say, why? Why is that the case? So Naperville is clearly identified as a sundown town. For those of you not familiar with the term, and we're just going to use one definition, although the 4 of us that you can see up here, we have had lengthy conversations about what the meaning of sundown town really is and how it can vary and shift. And that's one of the things that we're actually grappling with right now as we move forward on our project. But Naperville was a sundown town from a very traditional definition. If you were a person of color, you were not welcome to be in the town after dark. You might work at a business during the day. You might be a housekeeper. You might mow lawns, perhaps. But you were not welcome to be in the community once dusk fell. And there are a number of oral histories that we have, but we also have documentation both from city council records, and you'll see that there was a significant fair housing battle in Naperville in the 60s, of which we all have those similar stories of what was going on in our communities during that time period. So I think a number that's hard to grapple with in this moment right now is that if you look at Illinois, there are scholars who say that 71% of Illinois communities of more than 1,000 people were all white on purpose, and you can track that through census versus census. And how did this happen? And each of us actually has a really different story in our community. In the case of Naperville, Naperville was always exclusionary. From Joseph Naper's arrival in 1830, 1831, it was only a few short years before the Native American population is almost completely removed out of the Chicago area, certainly removed out of the Naperville area. And so Naperville had always been exclusionary. Other communities drove out existing black populations. You'll see that through our stories, a number prohibited black residents and also Jews, Mexicans, Native Americans, people of Asian descent, depending on where in the country you are, through restricted covenants. Those could be racially, ethnically, or religiously restricted covenants. And then also either informal or formal policies that might result in harassment or even threats of death to those who might dare to go outside of what was the community norm. This is an example of a racially restricted covenant in Naperville. This was from a 1950s Naperville subdivision. We've seen restrictive covenants so far as early as 1940, and we're on the lead for covenants that actually were earlier than that. In our particular case in Naperville, it specifies that if you're not Caucasian, you are not welcome to live in the community. So a number of the amenities, and not just amenities, but public services, right? School systems, were all white. Centennial Beach was essentially a segregated beach. We did have college students at the college who were Asian or black during the time periods that we're talking about here, the 50s, the 60s. They were not welcome to swim at the beach. But then change starts happening. First of all, we have the civil rights movement that's occurring in the 60s, but there's another significant change. The community had put in really a number of public policies, had really been moving toward bringing more tech into the community. So shifting away from just being essentially a community that was an agricultural community. We had Kraler manufacturing, really recruiting heavily businesses to come into Naperville. And what happens when you recruit businesses to come into your community? You get industries and you get organizations and you get corporations like Bell Labs, for example, that had been based out of New Jersey. And in a minute, I'm going to show you what happened with that. So we get to, and of course, I'm giving you the super highlights version of this story. So in 1960, Martin Luther King speaks at North Central College. And for some time, a lot of folks were going, oh my gosh, Naperville must have been so progressive. But that isn't what that was, right? It was Dr. King coming into the college and saying, you know, we all have to look at the entire Chicago metropolitan area. You can't separate the suburbs from the urban core, and we have to deeply look at housing. And of course, we know about the campaign that Dr. King waged in Chicago. And many North Central College students and faculty participated in some of those efforts. So you see a swell through we like to say the 3 C's. You see the swell in the community through 3 primary areas to begin seeing change. One is clergy. Not all clergy, but many clergy. You also see it through the college itself and through corporations. So those are some of the things that we'll actually be talking about in our exhibit when we unfold that. So it's like a ping pong ball in Naperville. There's surveys being done. The city council is saying, no, we're not going to move toward fair housing. And it goes back and forth. The Human Relations Study Group. Then things start to happen when Bell Labs is charged with a violation because they're New Jersey workers who are coming out, some of which were black. They are looking for residents in the community in which they're working, and they can't live in the community. So on the front page of the New York Times is Negro scientists invoke Rights Act to say realtors deny them homes in the Chicago suburb. And that Chicago suburb was Naperville. So you start seeing, as I was saying, you start seeing the beginnings of a groundswell, and then it really picks up toward the end of the 60s. And you see, of course, federal legislation that starts also driving this change. You see the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. Ultimately, after the assassination of Dr. King, you see the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And it's at that point in time, a couple of months later, July 1st, 68, that Naperville actually adopts anti-discrimination, local anti-discrimination legislation. I think the other important aspect of this, as we just took this really quick highlights journey of Naperville Story, is we're talking about an entire Chicago metropolitan area that was rooted in these forms of discriminations very, very widely across the entire area, whether it was in the actual city of Chicago where there was segregation, whether it was happening throughout the suburbs. This is a map from the year 2000. And if you take this map, and if you take a redlining map from the 40s, or if you take maps from earlier in the 20th century, you'll find that if they're color-coded, you could put one on top of the other, and today's map doesn't look that different from the maps of earlier in the 20th century. So the impacts of housing discrimination, certainly wealth disparities, segregation, community investment, interpersonal relations. If we don't know where we came from, the adage, how can we have community conversations? So Naperville's had its share of issues in the last 5 years or so. But knowing and understanding where we came from really has resulted in our ability to have more dynamic conversations about what we want the community to be, and where we want to go in the future. And I'm going to leave you with this last slide, which is just a quick smattering of a few of the different community activities and events that are happening now in Naperville. And so it's a moment where we're really pleased to be doing this work, and we will also be launching an on-site exhibit which will correspond with the online exhibit. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Robbins to tell us about Appleton.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I'd like to do the labor acknowledgement. We must acknowledge that much of what we know of this country today, including its culture, economic growth, and development throughout the history and across time, has been possible by the labor of enslaved Africans and their ascendants who suffered the horror of the transatlantic trafficking of their people, chattel slavery, and Jim Crow. We are indebted to their labor and their sacrifice, and must acknowledge the tremors that violence throughout the generations and the resulting impact that can be felt and witnessed today. But the bottom line is this: if we cannot collectively begin to acknowledge the historical labor that has allowed our society to get and be where it is today, then we will continue to struggle and reconcile and redress those histories and legacies. That is from Dr. Taria Stewart, Assistant Principal, Professor of Higher Education and Student Affairs at Iowa State University. Do I get the clicker? Today, I will talk about the Black experiences in Northeast Wisconsin. And from our perspective, it is the resiliency to establish a presence and roots within the region. African Heritage, Inc. is a 24-year-old nonprofit organization with the mission of sharing African American and Black culture in the region and to extend goodwill and to share our culture. And it's in this light that we're very excited and very honored to have the opportunity to participate. African Heritage is unapologetically Black. Our research is Black-centered, and our research also will reflect first voice. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. That is one of the songs from the Civil Rights Movement. I'll save you my singing voice. It's not great at all. When we started our work, we were told that Blacks had not come to Appleton until about the late 60s. And I'm like, it just doesn't sound right to me. And so as we started our work, African Heritage, along with our museum partner, felt it was important to establish a record. And we chose Carter G. Woodson's quote here to inform our work. Carter G. Woodson is known as the father of Black history, and the goal was to really build on the study of Black history and get people to understand the important roles of Black folks in the larger narrative of United States. The Unvarnished Northeast Wisconsin Black Experiences Project demonstrates the unyielding actions of Blacks, the Black struggle and resiliency to keep on a walking, keep on a talking, and marching to freedom land, to exist and own homes, gain access to quality education, jobs with livable wages, entrepreneurship, and to thrive and pursue liberty. Our story will show how Black adults, Black children, and others were active participants to exist in public places as citizens free of racial harm. Our stories We'll also show how Black visitors to Northeast Wisconsin were treated. In many cases, we have uncovered first-hand stories that were buried with the intention of not ever being discovered. When researching Black experiences in Northeast Wisconsin, the sources are scattered throughout the United States and not available locally within our own region. And thank you. I just would like to present part of our research team winning together. And we have won together. We've won together and secured the top 2 awards given to museums in the United States. And we'll continue to be winners as we collaborate and join in with the Unvarnished project. The purpose of our research and programs fulfill the mission as a truth and reconciliation effort in our community to reflect on past racism, acknowledge it, and move forward as a more equitable and safe place for Black people. And so we've been doing this research quite a while, and we continue in this work with the Unvarnished project. And what did we find out? Remember, I said the locals had said, well, Blacks didn't show up until the late 60s. The number one finding of our research is we were here all the time. And how do we know? I'm missing my slide. So what is not there is there's evidence that Blacks were in the region as early as the 1600s. We started, our first documented presence was as furriers in the northeast Wisconsin, and then under French slavery in the region. We were also here at the founding of Wisconsin, so much that is written Black codes into the state statutes allowing for slavery in Wisconsin, even though it was formerly a non-slave holding state. One of the things, if we could go back, one of the things I find, although I'm from corporate, the story is the same. We can't find Black people. Where are they? When I look at research, you know, there's this story that we didn't exist, and if we did exist, we had zero contributions. So when looking at places like Northeast Wisconsin that is comprised of mostly small cities, there may actually be evidence that Blacks were in the region and exist, and where to look. We are challenging those that live in such communities and towns to look at your local sources, your census, newspapers, your city directories, cemetery records. In Appleton, we knew that there were 3 Blacks in the cemetery. During our site visit trip for Unvarnished, I just stepped in to the office and said, do you have records of other Blacks or African Americans that are buried in the cemeteries, the Riverside? You guys remember that? Lo and behold, I got 22 additional records of Blacks that were buried there before 1920. So learning how to ask for the information and to keep checking, even if they first tell you no, you may get a different result. Even during our site visit, we had more discoveries at the church. You all remember? There is a church. And the guy, today it's a wedding chapel. But back in the early 1900s, it was a church. And I asked, do you have old records that show who were members? And did you look at those records? And do you recall any African Americans or blacks that belonged to that church? And he said, yeah, there's this box of papers that came with the building. And I said, well, you know, we're just a few historians just out visiting different cities. Could I perhaps maybe have those papers? And you know what he said? Remember, guys? He said, yes, I got all those papers. So it's just a matter of remembering to ask and not assume that there's no black residents or people that are in the area. And when you find that information, fight to have it included into your city's history so that we all can have a better understanding of who lived there and what were some of their experiences. So the narrative of our project is not revisionist history, but a documented piece of regional foundational research that clearly show the institutional cultural systems intentionally designed to marginalize and erase the very existence of blacks and their contributions to the emerging and founding of the region. Okay. Appleton, Wisconsin is a microcosm of our larger work and taking a step back and looking more broadly at the Northeast region. And it helps position our understanding of what was really going on in the region, and focus continues on agency of black families that were impacted by exclusion and acts of violence. These are some of the first residents. So Horace Artist, again, as you see, 1890, is our first understanding of who we thought was the first black resident of Appleton, Wisconsin. And then we also found Joseph Elmore. It's from the discovery of these two gentlemen. As you see, Horace Artist served in the Civil War and is a veteran. And once we started digging in, we're like, I wonder if other blacks were in the area. And guess what we found? More black people, a whole bunch. And so we're like, oh my gosh, it's Northeast Wisconsin. And we found Lucretia Newman Coleman. She was a student at Lawrence University. You all may know that university. It's a fine arts, liberal arts private school in Appleton. And then we found another gentleman there, Claude Paris. I want to see, because we can't see who he is. How do I do the? You know, it's sad I own a technology company, but I'm really not showing mastery of the technology. Let's see. I want to use the pointy thing, the light. Where is that? What do I do? There. Oh, there it is. I'm going to point him out. There he is, in the center there. That's Claude. He played on the football team. And there we were entrepreneurs. So Miss Hollingsworth, Emma Elmore there, owned a beauty salon and worked there. And that's a picture of historic downtown Appleton. And that early group of blacks in the area were known as the Black Aristocracy. And they were able to be part of the community and thrive. But there's also, I just want to also just give context of, as we extended our research beyond Appleton, here are some of the census numbers to show the number of blacks in the area. And I like to see this because as you look at those dates, look at some of what we're seeing in 1860 and 70 and what's going on. And so for someone to tell us, you know, you black people didn't show up until the late 60s is obviously false. And what we do know is that as we approach the 1920s in Appleton, by the time of the 1920 census, our numbers went down to 0 or nearly 0. So that period of time, we don't know what was the signifying event that drove the black population nearly to 0 in Northeast Wisconsin. So our work will continue. There's documentation of a sundown town. So in our region, it wasn't a law, but it was an enforced practice. Donna had mentioned earlier that our group grappled with different examples and definitions of sundown town. Because Appleton, we weren't able to establish roots. We were really just trying to exist. We did not have the opportunity to own homes, and we didn't have a significant black population. So I just wanted to share what I think is a more functional definition of sundown town as it relates to Northeast Wisconsin. It was just, the racial exclusion was just so pervasive that blacks were not able to establish real roots. And so Northeast Wisconsin is predominantly white by design. So sundown towns for me means that they're all white communities, neighborhoods, or counties that exclude blacks and other minorities through the use of discriminatory laws, harassments, threats, or use of violence. The name derives from the posted and verbal warnings issued to blacks, although they may not be allowed to work or travel in the community during the daytime, and they must leave by sundown. Although the term most often refers to forced exclusion of blacks, the history of sundown towns also includes prohibitions against the Jewish, Native Americans, Chinese, Japanese, and other minority groups. And sometimes in Northeast Wisconsin, against Catholics as well, and Italians. So I just wanted to share that with you. And one of the ties that we have to this area is Dr. Percy Julian, who is a famous researcher and chemist. Although he was offered a position in Appleton, he was not able to secure housing, and that's how he ended up in Chicago, denied housing in Appleton, and came here and continued to do his great work. Housing was such an issue that Dr. Martin Luther King came to our area to appeal and tell people that Appleton could be a haven for African Americans and blacks if they can secure housing. So one of the consistent findings that we have from the early part of the 1900s, even throughout today, is the role of the police and its role in controlling and monitoring the very movement of blacks in the area. And that continues today in terms of policing in our communities. I earlier showed a picture of Horace Artis, that veteran. He was able to secure housing back in the 1800s. Records, it shows that he was arrested a number of times based on vagrancy rules. So you have the local police knowing that you have a black man as a homeowner, arresting him for vagrancy. And as we look at records, we see that every single Black man that lived in the Appleton region had been arrested for vagrancy laws, and one of them was arrested and had to spend Christmas in jail. Sundown town custom was not consistent in application. Each business took their own position regarding it. And so you have the Tuskegee singers out of Alabama, although hired to sing and entertain in the area, were barred from staying in hotels. And then I just want to whiz through and not walk through the evidence, but just show that we have documented experiences of what Blacks were facing in the area. And that include churches opening up their pulpit for the Ku Klux Klan to come in and openly recruit. Go to the next. And it's part of a regional cause and effect of racial terror in the Midwest. So what we see here, Black family leaving their home in after white mob violence. That's in 1919. So we see the broad region, this intense period of violence in the Midwest, the intense removal is more obvious in Appleton, but it's isolated of what is going on with Blacks everywhere. Our work today takes this history into account, but brings it more strongly into the 1950s. Black men, women, and families still saw promise and opportunity in our region. Frequent location for tourists and vacationers, business peoples. We have 2 families in Oshkosh and 2 families in Appleton that provided housing, food, fuel, and logistics. So our new work will focus on this area and these everyday activists who challenge the Fox Valleys to live up to their potential. So we're finding a lot of information from the Green Book. And in some of your communities, they may be listed in the book as a way for you to see how welcoming it was and what those experiences were like. So what did we learn? We learned how to collect stories and bring that to the present. The present is explained by the past, so it's all connected. Go to the next. And our goal is to have one story that is inclusive, the same memory, and a shared responsibility of research and including all voices, and sharing that widely so that it's never lost to historical memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. We're going to pivot to right back to the region. We have a story very broadening. How many of you? I know some people are listening on streaming, but how many of you in the audience? Let's actually go to you because we're here face to face, which is so great. How many of you have been to Park, Illinois? Show of hands. Excellent. How many of you think of Oak Park as the Frank Lloyd Wright or Ernest Hemingway connection? These famous people, great architecture of Wright, etc. How many of you think of Oak Park as a diverse suburb, as a suburb that has a fair amount of racial integration? And I see a number of hands, like less than the tourist number of hands. But the idea that that's really the modern view of Oak Park. I think a real Oak Park story in the last 50 years has been a community that's embraced diversity, that consciously decided to choose to be a community that was racially integrated. But it's a complicated story. It's a story filled with contradictions. And we see along the way, even within the group, been a bit of it's a success story, but not a perfection story. Not a story that doesn't still need people working on these issues. So our story is sort of, let's go back in time and hear the earlier days of Oak Park, and then kind of bring it up to the present and how the community has focused on that. You see Open House, the legacy of fair housing, even before we're involved in the project, we're working on an exhibit in our new facility, telling the story of housing in Oak Park. What would happen if Oak Park didn't embrace fair housing in the late 60s? So we'll come back to that towards the end, but now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
So Oak Park has its first population boom post-Chicago fire. A lot of attention about the Chicago fire anniversary. Move west a little bit from the place of work to period running through Oak Park. Now, to but back then there was still a lot of hinterland between what was considered part of the city and where Oak Park is. Historians such as Ken or Fishman, who the classic suburb, so community class predominantly white and Protestant, but a new wave of historians kind of coming in 20 would did a better job being this growing community that Sabrina mentioned and you have the area, you also have a black community that's growing right of black community there. It's these are periods never reaching quite 100% of the Oak Park until very present. 1930, rose from about 10,000 people to 60,000, so you have this major early period of growth. And in the beginning part of that period, kind of late 1890s, 1880s to 1890s is when Chicago was going through what I like to call its annexation fever. And to hit 1 million by 1890 to show its resurgence. And as Phoenix rising from the ashes post-Chicago fire, it really wanted to hit 1 million for the 1890 census. So they start annexing communities south and west. The eastern of what Oak Park was part of the community was part of the suburbs of Berwyn and as well as the Austin neighborhood, Chicago's west side. The easternmost part of Austin had already been chipped off in the early 1890s. In the late 1890s, this issue came up again. Major element that kept Oak Park from becoming part of Chicago was Oak Park's long commitment to town. It had been a community since the 18th century. Chicago, with the Protestant continuing Oak Park, who had made it such, break into its own community. Of Baptist Church in 1985. Thank you. The top left are members of the congregation. They had and getting a location for south of South Lake Street, same Lake Street coming directly west out of the city. Was a community along William Street. This is you have the church built, and around that you have various businesses and residents owned by the black community. This was not the only place within Oak Park that the black community was located, so it wasn't like one little section within Oak Park. You have African American families living in kind of the northwest section and the south. What we've heard from Naperville and Appleton that it was not a sundown of leave the homes we so in let you kind of at the moment we have the black church built, the African American community was able to build their church before Catholics were in the community. A couple years later, the two Catholics towards the Catholic population, either that's claimed when they had the division of the women who they had headquarters in Little Rock. So of what women should have to pay for money. So you see chapter with Klan in Oak Park called the Willosis Club. They often took pseudonyms to kind of hide what their agenda actually was. And you have over 300 members, and it seems to be the epicenter for women's Klan activity in the Chicago area. So at the same time, we have a lot of, an amazing resource of their biweekly minutes, 5 years of the biweekly minutes of this chapter of the Women's Klan in Oak Park. So we kind of know the mundane daily activities that they were doing. There's no mention of the black community in these records. What they're concerned about is the encroachment of Catholics from the west side into Oak Park. And around the same time period in the 1920s, towards the end of the 1920s, is when Oak Park starts to look to redevelop its downtown area, and they turn their sights to that black community centered around Mount Carmel Church that's half a block south. So I'm making the story much less complex than it was, but for sake of time, the black community that was there is pushed out. Mount Carmel reestablishes its just west suburb of Maywood. It's predominantly working to middle class African American community, and the community scatter and redevelop further west, stay within Oak Park, but this is a low point for the African American community within Oak Park. And I will let Frank pick it up from there.
Sure. On this, I think Sarah was being humble. She's an expert on the women of the KKK and is very knowledgeable. So for questions afterward, if anybody has any questions, but see this sort of transition that Sarah's just laid out is the welcoming to the extent that we're able to buy land, build their own church, this black community, and yet you have this sort of two-edged sword moving forward from this point forward. On the slide that we just left, we don't have to go back, there's a photograph of a football team. In the 1930s, there's a black player at Oak Park River Forest High School. He was a star of the football team. They're undefeated in 1937, and they first agree to accept an invitation to play Miami Senior High School down in the Orange Bowl, the new facility that became the Orange Bowl a little bit later, brand new facility. And then they rescinded the offer when they found out there's a black player on the Oak Park team. So Oak Park gave him the choice of going or not. He chose not to go, to not let his teammates down, and they still played down there. So there's Oak Park writing in the letters to the editor in the paper, including Dr. Percy Julian, who lives in Maywood at that point, just to our west. There's this idea of like, we're a community that's welcoming. We have some of these black residents in our own community, they're our neighbors, and yet we're not fully supporting. We're kind of caving into Jim Crow in that case. So again, there's this nuance, this complexity of support and lack of support. And so moving on, after that, Dr. Julian moves to town in 1950. Again, he had lived in Maywood after not being able to move to Appleton, and Maywood, again, just to the west of River Forest, our two villages, Oak Park and River Forest, that share a high school. And he moves in and buys a home in the estate section. Even though, as Sarah's just told you, we have black residents in the community, but he moves into one of the grander homes in town, and twice his house gets attacked. Again, it brings the same sort of nuances to this story of the outright, we sort of want good versus evil, right? We want the people who are fighting for racial integration and for fairness and for people to live and to work wherever they choose. And then you have this community that's shown some openness to the black population, yet twice this house gets attacked. And again, then that peels off into residents coming before the board saying, send extra security, don't let this happen. Whereas some other people in the community are kind of saying under their breath usually, because there's some evidence of sort of behind the scenes, well, maybe he shouldn't be here. That's not really, why does he want to live in our community? Again, a community that had black residents from the earliest days. So there's kind of this breaking off Oak Park from the 50s when Dr. Julian moves in town in 1950, 50s moving to the 60s, the national civil rights movement, and the Oak Park version goes from Dr. Julian to a 1963 incident. There's two images up there about this young African-American woman who is a violinist who is asked as basically practicing with the local symphony, which is 100% white, the Oak Park Workforce Symphony, and the head of the symphony beside the conductor and said, "We're not ready for a great symphony." 1963, think of all the civil rights activity, and start saying, "Wait a second, like that gets into the headline in the Chicago papers. So you're blocking a black violinist, one black violinist in our symphony? What's the reasons here?" The conductor, who happened to be Jewish, and brings up the fact that he lost his relatives in the Holocaust, and he was always against any kind of discrimination. He says, "I'm resigning, but he's going to perform the next symphony, the next performance of the symphony." So you get people standing up, individuals who are saying this community can and should be different. It's been maybe a little bit more welcoming than some communities, and yet there's not been this ongoing, are we the sort of community that people can, the right of all people to live where they choose? So after that incident in 63, they form a Human Relations Commission, a government action. The Village of Oak Park has a Human Relations Commission, and then there's a private Citizens Committee for Human Rights formed within 6 months of each other. So you have sort of public and private that are fighting for, as in full-page ad they take out in the local newspaper, the right of all people to live where they choose. And you see a lot of the religious leaders in the community, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, but then there's a couple synagogues in Oak Park and River Forest, and they're fighting to have the sort of aspirations of the community match up with its actions, right? Oak Park always itself, and the public image back in this period is an open-minded place compared to some, and yet there's all this falling short of values, not living up to those values. So there starts to be, there's an image below in 1965, Dominican student, now it's called Dominican University, Rose College then, Concordia University, which is a Lutheran University in River Forest. The two River Forest universities, they have students marching for fair housing. That banner to the lower right, "We seek equal service from realtors." There were things called M listings, where the local board of realtors, if you went to list your house, you could check a box that said, "You shall or shall not show this property to persons of all races." So literally, institutional racism was, we heard the beginning, Kremen's talking about that, right? The institutional racism that exists. The reality is, you had to change that system. So again, the part of the Oak Park story is the hopefulness that yes, 1968, the same year that the federal legislation passes, Oak Park passes a fair housing ordinance that particularly blocks M listings. A lot of black residents of the 60s had to actually go to a friend, a so-called straw buyer, a white person, to buy your house for you, and then you'd of course pay them, it's your house, but because when black folks went up to open houses, they were turned away. Oh, it just was leased. It was just rented, right? So you get this idea of the Oak Park story becoming very positive, marches before Warner to try to block these kind of things, and yet 20,000 people sign up a petition, no forced housing. So the fair housing gets flipped. You're trying to force us to do something that takes away our freedoms. You're saying that even though the community might agree that we're not racist, a lot of people are saying, we're racist, we just don't think we should be forced to do something. So what happens after that, and that's sort of a place to sort of bring this forward rapidly, is the Oak Park story. And the reason why I think a number of you maybe raised your hands, you thought Oak Park was a more diverse suburb, is in 1968, when Naperville was passing a fair housing ordinance, as Oak Park did, Oak Park, as a matter of public policy, said we're going to make this work. We're actually just going to not have this on the books. So what happened was there was a whole series of public and private initiatives that were focused on making the Oak Park of that was less than 0.1% black in the 1970 census. By 1980, by 1990, go up to 20% black population more, because demographically, there was so-called white flight from the west side of the city, so there were more white people moving out to the suburbs. But those black folks that were wanting to move out to the suburbs themselves, Oak Park started to welcome some of those folks, right? Not just saying, jump over us. And a local village board member at the time said very publicly, we have three choices. We can run and be a white flight community. We can be a community that says stay out, or we can find a new way that honors our values and puts practical step approaches. And so things like actually advertising a sort of publicity piece about the park that shows a mixed racial group there, the very 1970s Oak Park, the people place, they're sitting around a fire, just like hanging out, and then they find schools showing a racially integrated classroom. Again, in the early 70s, with the idea of busing and other issues, were really inflaming America. Oak Park said, let's just be all in. Let's decide to be that sort of community. And so that's sort of what got us to the point of today. I know moving ahead, just to give you a couple, it's a little bit hard to see this, but you see the sort of growth on the left of the overall population related to African-American population numbers, and then on the right for the schools. These very small numbers becoming larger and larger, and what Oak Park was doing in the talking about spreading the word, Oak Park started embracing it and said the Oak Park strategy. And at first, people write in the Tribune, oh my gosh, in the Chicago Tribune, what's going to happen to Oak Park now that they're embracing this? And enough leaders of the community, enough people in official positions and these organizations, grassroots organizations and individuals, there got to be enough critical mass that they're advertising, and some of the new residents moving in said, I'm going to choose Oak Park because it's a more racially diverse community. So they kind of flipped the narrative and saying, don't be afraid of the races coming together. It's like, no, but that's exactly, we want to live together. We want to try to find a way to make this work in our community. And so that led to some real numbers on the street. Do you want to jump in?
I'll just leave it here on the Chicago metro area that's broken down demographically. Getting back to what Dow had mentioned, that if you take this 2010 census data that's breaking people out, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, and other races, and if we were to take a homeowners loan corporation match, the maps that redline communities from the 1930s, and overlay that with Chicago today, it would look pretty similar. So that would show you how pervasive these exclusionary housing practices were. We are still feeling the ramifications of them today.
And is this a good place to go for questions? Or yeah.
What we're going to do is we're going to invite questions and conversations at the flight deck. We have a light refreshments at the flight deck. If you head out into the lobby here and go to the left, you'll find the flight deck, and we'll ask the panelists to come and have their conversations there. I want to, Frank, you want to add something?
No, I just want to say the personal choice, right? We work on things that it's so systematic, looking back and saying it hasn't changed, but any community can decide to make some changes, and that's really the positive message of this sometimes very depressing topic, is that we can all make those choices. So,
I want to thank the panelists so much for their program today.